May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, doing our bit to preserve the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths cross his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today, our guest is Micah Sawyer. Micah is the son of Ken and Elizabeth Sawyer, who were students of Shunryu Suzuki, and he spent a number of his early years at Green Gulch Farm. He was born there 8 days, I can't remember now, before, or I think 8 days after my son Kelly was born. I've been very close with his parents and have, watched Micah grow up. Of course, he's going to be 50 this year. So, but, we always think of our kids as kids somewhat. Micah's son, Micah Jr., died of a fentanyl overdose at the age of 22, 4 years ago in June. And, it was a great tragedy and very painful, of course, for him and Micah's mother and Micah Jr.'s mother and Micah's current wife, Michelle, and for Ken and Elizabeth, and, all of us who were close. Micah and his wife, Michelle, after some period of time, wasn't too long, they started dealing with the fentanyl, opiate, OD issue. And they founded an organization called Micah's Hugs. You can go to it at micahshugs.org. MICAHS.org. And Micah is going to talk about what Micah's Hugs is all about and what it's done, which is very impressive, what they've done, and about the whole addiction problem, which is so enormous now in America and worldwide. And he talks about, somewhat about growing up around Zen Center, too, San Francisco Zen Center. So just as soon as we've had our pause to meditate, we'll give Micah a call. So when you hear the bell, if you're of such a mind, hit pause and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause, and we'll be here to hit the bell to end the meditation or whatever, and we'll give Micah Sawyer a call.
Hey, David.
Hi, Micah. How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
All right. All right. Yeah.
What's our time difference there? What time is it where you're at?
It's 5 minutes after 10 in the morning. So
Right.
you're at 5 after 7 in the evening. Let's see. No, you're in Santa Rosa, California.
Yeah, pretty close to Santa Rosa. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to talk to you about Micah's hugs
Sure.
but everything else, your whole life up to now, whatever you want to talk about.
Scary.
So, why don't just tell me what's on your mind now? What are you up to? What are you up to? These days.
Well, we're doing the, Sawyer construction is still going full time, and Ken's still in there full time doing. Well, he's not quite full time, but he's still doing most of the estimating and stuff. So, my full time job is still the construction business and building custom homes, rolling away with that. But the Micah Sawyer thing is what we do on the side. Is kind of taken off these days, and we're doing quite a bit of work with. Micah Sawyer with helping people with substance abuse issues, especially young people trying to do. Education, trying to reduce the stigma through education, and also doing a lot with harms reduction. When Micah passed away, that was sort of one of the things that I realized is that, we're kind of lacking in the harm reduction thing and the whole commercial industry of abstinence-only rehab, live-in rehab is sort of just pushing that only, and there's a lot of people that could use a lot of help in the harm reduction aspect. So that's what we decided to sort of work with, and we got into doing quite a bit. Which took us a while to sort of figure out what we wanted to do and find out where the need was. And one of the big things we started doing was Narcan training. And are you familiar with Narcan?
Yeah, I am. But why don't you refresh my memory?
Sure. So Narcan is a drug that, brings somebody back from an opioid overdose by blocking the opioid receptors in somebody's body so that it just stops, having any effect in their body. And for a long time, it was an injection that took a needle and a vial, but they turned it into a nasal spray now, which makes it, much easier for the average person to not be intimidated by using a nasal spray. And it works really well. But when Micah was using, and I was kind of worried about him, I used to buy Narcan for $150 a box. And I sort of realized that, how many people out there that are struggling that can't really afford that, especially when sometimes it takes many doses to bring somebody back. We've heard of up to 12 doses to bring somebody back from an overdose.
Wow. Wow. Now you say 12 doses. Yeah. And are you still talking about a nasal?
Yeah, it's a nasal spray, and what we distribute, there's boxes that have 2 doses in each box, so it's a little like a little plastic device that you push up on a plunger, and it administers 1 dose, and then you throw it away and grab another one. So the boxes that we distribute have 2 doses in each box, but it's hard to get. You have to have a prescription, and we kind of decided that we wanted to try to get as much of it out there as possible. So Michelle wrote grants, and we've gotten 2 grants now for about almost 6,000 boxes of Narcan. And so we figured that's worth a little bit no more than $500,000 worth of Narcan. We've been able to distribute it into the community and get it out there. And we've heard back a number of cases where people have actually used what we've gotten them to, to save somebody's life and bring it back. So we figured that was really working well. So we kept sort of pushing this. They are removing the prescription requirement from it.
Yeah, that's great. What I wanted to ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how you distribute it?
Yeah.
How do you distribute it if they need a prescription? They have to go get it and then you give it, or?
No. So the way it works is we have a prescription to get it in quantities, and we have a grant that pays for it from the state of California Health Department of Health. And we are allowed to give it to somebody that doesn't have a prescription as long as we teach them how to use it. So that's where we started doing these trainings where we get groups of people together, and anybody that was interested in any, establishment that was interested. We've done it in bars, we've done it in firehouses, we've done it for kids, high school kids, things like that. But we'll put a little thing together where we do a Narcan training, and that also just turns into an educational thing for, at the same time, people always have lots of other questions. So going through this and, going through what I did with my son's, substance abuse and his issues, I've learned a lot, and I've been around those too much, unfortunately. So we do a lot of education at the same time we're doing Narcan training, just in the whole issue of substance abuse and what's happening out there and what the problems are. And fentanyl, is the biggest problem right now in terms of, the real issues with substance abuse, and the deaths that are happening are about, the last we heard, it's about 80% of the deaths from overdose are from fentanyl related.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest piece of it. We also do, we have fentanyl test strips where people can test other substances to see if there's fentanyl in them. And we distribute those, and we do training on how to use the fentanyl test strips for people that want to try to stay away from it. Unfortunately, when we first started doing this, I had the idea that I was going to be giving out fentanyl test strips to people that were using heroin so they could test the heroin to make sure there's no fentanyl in it. But very quickly after my son passed away, heroin kind of dried up. People couldn't get it, and the only thing they could get was fentanyl. So now, opioid addicts are mostly just doing fentanyl, and they know it's fentanyl, and so they don't really need to test it to stay away from fentanyl because they know that's what they're doing. But people that are still want to do, they're getting a lot of contamination in other drugs. So people that want to do cocaine and make sure there's no fentanyl in it, or meth or other substances, can test it to make sure they're staying away from the fentanyl.
Wow. Somebody putting fentanyl in cocaine. I mean,
oh, it's super, super common. And now the big thing now is that they've done a big cutback on prescription medication. So if you have, prescription painkillers, and a lot of people are addicted to their doctor's prescription of opioid painkillers, and now they've changed the laws so they can't prescribe near as much. But what they weren't paying attention to is the fact that they had all these addicts out there that were addicted to what they were getting from their doctor. And when they cut them back really hard, they had to go look for a different source for the medication, and they started buying black market prescription pills. But unfortunately, these black market prescription pills are now mostly containing fentanyl. So that's where a lot of these overdoses are coming from, because people think they're taking an oxycodone or something like that, and it actually turns out to be fentanyl.
Wow.
So that's a big part of the education that we're trying to do, is teach people what's happening and teach people how much of those drugs are containing fentanyl and how easy it is to overdose.
Wow. Yeah.
So Micah, when he was doing heroin, and he had a phobia of needles, so he was only smoking heroin. So he was smoking black tar heroin, and he was clean for about 7 months, or he was doing really well. At least he may have had some slips in that period, but he had a job and he was doing really well, and he had a relapse. And I used to think in the old days, the fact that he didn't ever shoot up might kind of really protect him, because it's pretty hard to die of an overdose of heroin when you're smoking it, because you'll tend to just sort of go to sleep before you get such a big dose.
Yeah.
But fentanyl, when he relapsed, he smoked black tar heroin that was contaminated with fentanyl, and just the smoking of it is what killed him.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Oh.
Yeah. So they even said in the coroner's report that he had no track marks and that he wasn't injecting anything. So. But, the fentanyl changed that whole story, where it's no longer like you can definitely now die of an overdose from smoking it.
Oh, you can't. Oh, yeah, sure. Right.
Yeah.
Ouch.
It used to be pretty hard to die of an overdose from smoking heroin, but with fentanyl now it's not so hard anymore.
Yeah. Got it. And with opium, that used to be a big problem with opium addiction in China, of course. And it's harder to get addicted to opium, of course, than heroin or morphine, but, it still happened.
Yeah. It's stronger, and it's more potent, and it's faster. And that's part of the reason people always want to know why, too. Like, why are they putting fentanyl, which is a downer, of course, and cocaine, which is an upper? And a big part of the reason is that fentanyl is more addictive than cocaine. So if they can get you more addicted to it faster, so you're buying more, then their profits go up.
Wow. What about the There was one family I associated with fentanyl. Is that true?
Well, you're probably thinking of the Slacker family.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing I followed closely.
Okay.
But
So
what
my
about
guess is
that
that,
end of it? The
yeah,
the business end of it, the legal end of it.
yeah.
Uh,
So there was a big, explosion in opioid addiction, and it was kind of a little bit pre-fentanyl, and it was in the OxyContin. And OxyContin, which was the Slacker family that owns Purdue Pharma, that was producing OxyContin and
right,
telling
right.
and basically telling people that it was not addictive and it was safe and you could take it without worrying about it, when those lawsuits have now proven that they knew way early how bad it really was and how addictive it really was, but they were lying to people about the addictive powers of it. The other problem with OxyContin is that it's a slow time release pill in OxyContin, so you can take a much stronger pill that's slowly time release without getting as strong. But what the addicts were doing, of course, is they were crushing it up and snorting it, which sort of makes it no longer slow time release anymore. So you're getting a much stronger, much more potent dose once you crush it up and snort it. So the Sackler family was responsible, and that's when a lot of these, what they call the pill mills or the pill doctors, that were just, they'd sign 1,000 prescriptions on a tablet and just hand them out to anybody that would give them $100. And so they had a lot of these doctors and, that were just sort of getting rich off of selling these prescriptions to anybody that wanted it. So the Sacker family, they had this whole thing where they've gone through these lawsuits and they had to pay quite a bit of money, but part of their court settlement sort of unfortunately protected the biggest part of the family money. So the Sackler family are still one of the richer families in the world that have, paid out a nice chunk of money in a court settlement, but they're still a super, super rich family.
Yeah.
Fentanyl, though, fentanyl in itself is, it's what most people get as a pain killer when you're going in for surgery. It's what your
is that right?
In the operating room, yeah. And it's because it's the most strongest, most potent, and it's when it's used by the proper person and the proper dose who knows what they're doing. It's really helpful for when you're in the operating room, but unfortunately, it gets abused too easily when it's outside of that.
So now, you were talking about how there was a gap in how to deal with addiction, and mainly there was the sort of AA approach of just stop doing it and have a community that that helps you keep off it or go into rehab. And we're involved, mainly Katrinka, with a treatment program here, and AA and Al-Anon, and at least half our friends are involved with that. And I wonder if there's any program like what you're talking about here. I never see any evidence of alcoholism or drug taking. I mean, there's no, in a big event where it's full of young people, there's hardly anybody drinking. There's no bad behavior. But then when I talk to Indonesians I know, who are like middle age or something, a lot of them would tell me about periods when they were heroin addicts or and that is a problem here. And alcohol and alcohol also in Asia, what I've noticed is that, here and in India, you don't see it much, but if you talk to people that deal with it, it's there's a big problem with alcohol. You know,
so it's a little more behind the scenes and hidden, huh?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But
well, alcohol here, is just so socially accepted, and every event you go to is alcohol related, and it's I think that's a part of why alcoholics have such a hard time, because it's, you can sort of decide to stop doing heroin and keep away from people that do heroin, but it's pretty hard to stay away from alcohol when it's everywhere.
Yeah, well, Katrinka, Katrinka and I, we don't mind being around alcohol. We've even, I haven't had a drink in not 19 years or something. She's like 25. And sometimes we'll keep alcohol. Somebody will give us a bottle of wine. We'll say, oh, Kelly's coming in 3 months. Let's just keep it for him. But I know other people wouldn't do that, wouldn't trust themselves with that. So I guess it depends on the individual.
Well, I think the other thing that we're starting to try to work on more, and that some of the programs around here are starting to work on more, is like there's a large community of people that are sort of somewhat abusing substances, and they're having a smaller sort of a problem. They kind of don't like where they're heading and drinking a bit too much, but they're not quite ready to say, hey, I'm an alcoholic and I need to go to AA, or I need to go to a recovery program. And are there ways we can help somebody just, stop it before it gets to that point, stop it, with getting, better habits with substances instead of waiting until it's become a huge problem, So.
Yeah. Do you remember the Drug Policy Institute that was founded by a guy named Nate? No, it's the Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan Nadelman. It was funded by George Soros, and I went and heard him. He was like, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, he was like introducing the idea of harm reduction to a much wider audience.
Sure.
And so, and I remember at Zen Center, there was a woman there who was working with people in the Tenderloin, Jana Draka. She was talking around Zen Center about harm reduction. It was like just, this is like, 20, 25 years ago. It was just the idea was just being introduced. So, is harm reduction, is that still the guiding principle in dealing with substance abuse?
Unfortunately, not enough. And I think part of the issue is that, substance abuse treatment has become huge money-making thing, and it's become very, commercialized with big companies that are running these, substance or abstinence-only programs that they're doing, and that's the biggest way they can figure out to make money out of it, is to run these really expensive abstinence-only rehab programs, live-in programs that cost a ton, and they get insurance companies to pay for them. And unfortunately, it's sort of a very small percentage of people, but it's sort of the people, I think, that have figured out better ways to work with people that are starting to really sort of push this abstinence-only concept. And I think it's also sort of becoming a bit bigger because of fentanyl. Because you're realizing that if you can get somebody to be on, morphine instead of fentanyl, obviously morphine isn't, it's not great to be addicted to morphine, but with a regulated dose, you're much less likely to die than you are of using fentanyl.
Oh, yeah. And what about methadone? That was like a really big thing not that long ago. I was at a methadone clinic in Berlin 10 years, about 11 years ago. And what I've what I've always heard from people in drug treatment, including this German doctor, I was staying with him in there. He was a Buddhist priest, he was a Zen priest. Is they don't like methadone, but it was what the government allowed them to use. What's happening with methadone these days?
So there are methadone clinics around. I think that there's a couple of problems that's hard to get too many people too interested in them. And I think, one is they're pretty regulated and you have to go into a clinic to get your, small amount of methadone that you can use. So you have to go in fairly regularly, and there's not that many methadone clinics around. So especially for people that are really having much higher substance abuse problems that sort of want to use regularly and don't have a hard time getting to wherever that clinic is, which is probably far away from where they're living. And a lot of people that are, especially like the homeless population or the really severe, the people with the severe cases of substance abuse, I think that it's just hard for them to get to the clinic enough. I know there are people that use it to help with the treatment, and there's some people that are successful with it, but it's not huge. It's not super big. And I think, like from where we're at, I don't think there's a methadone clinic very close to us, so people would have to go kind of far to get there. And again, like you said, I don't think people like it as much. So people will do it if they're really trying hard to work on it, but it's not their preferred drug of choice. But you're right, it's definitely a much, much safer, way to get it. And there's still addictions to methadone, of course. It's not a perfect thing, but
yeah. Well, that's why
definitely the lesser of two evils.
Yeah. I've heard from a couple of doctors who were using it that they thought it was just as addictive as heroin.
Right. Yes. I've heard that too, but then I think the thing is that because it's much more well regulated and it's sort of prescription medication, that you can keep your dose well regulated, and even if you're more addicted, just as addicted to it, you're less likely to overdose and you're less likely to die from it because you can more easily regulate what you're taking.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big problems with fentanyl. Fentanyl is so incredibly powerful and potent. It only takes a very small number of grains of salt to overdose on it. And to try to regulate your dose is really hard. And I was just learning recently that the street fentanyl that people are buying on the street can be anywhere between 5 to 95% pure. So if you're used to taking something that's 5% pure and then you get a batch that's 95% pure, you're probably going to overdose, so it's very hard to regulate the dose that you're taking, which is part of why if we had a better system like the methadone that people could take of something that is sort of pharmaceutically regulated with a specific dose, I think it would, the deaths at least would become much, much less. You still may get addicted to it just as easily, but you're probably not going to overdose and die on it in the same way. I think that in the United States, deaths last year was about 110,000 deaths, and about 80% of those were from fentanyl. So,
wow, that is so incredible. That's such a huge number. Think of that. Number. Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, even if we had a program that didn't necessarily stop the addiction or stop the problem, if we could change what people were struggling with to something that didn't actually kill you, at least we can massively reduce the number of deaths that we were getting. Wow. And maybe that would be methadone, maybe that would be morphine, maybe that would be something else that could be regulated in a way that's not so easy to overdose on.
Wow. Well, it's certainly much more true now than it was before that you really shouldn't mess with it at all.
Yeah, it makes it difficult to be a safe user. It makes it
wow. I mean, I used to be around pure heroin, and right. I didn't particularly like it, which was good. But the amount of it that could kill somebody was very small. I mean, very small, like a little needle of pure heroin. Somebody who'd never had it could be dangerous.
And the fentanyl that they have now is around 100 times stronger than heroin, so it's a tiny little amount of that. So
you were talking about grains. You know how many?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, what about the law?
I'm kind of happy to see. We were in Washington D.C. Oh God, I know, a month and a half ago, something like that. And we were working with another group that we met there called Today I Matter, and we did this poster project where we set up, bust 24-inch by 36-inch posters of people's faces that had died of overdose, and we put them on the Capitol Mall right in front of the Washington Monument. And it really brought a lot of attention, to it, and people coming by and seeing the actual faces of people really means a lot more than just hearing the numbers. So it was pretty impactful. But we also went to the DEA museum where they have in Washington D.C. The DEA has a museum of, it's a pretty interesting museum. But as you walk into the hall of the museum, they have a memorial to people that have died of fentanyl overdose, I was kind of happy to see the DEA taking this in a different direction than what I usually think of the DEA as, where they're actually having a memorial for these people. And my son's picture is actually up on the wall in this memorial. There's 2,000 pictures of people. And it seems like the DEA's concept used to be that these are all just the scumbags we need to put in prison. And now they're actually accepting the fact that they're human and that they're more than just that. And I think their approach has really been turning to the large cartel dealer, and they're not putting as much emphasis on busting the street level dealer as they used to. I think sort of understanding that. And something that I came to understand when my son was struggling is that the low level dealer on the street is often just another addict that's your friend that finds a source and sells it to you, and they sell it to their friend, and they sell it to their friend. And
yeah.
So I think a lot of the concept that we have of, there's the poor victim of the drug dealer, and then there's these big bad drug dealers that we need to all lock up. I think I started to realize that mostly what I saw was they're all sort of, kids that are suffering and that are finding a source and selling it to their friends, and then their friends are selling it. There is a higher level at some point, of course, which is the sort of cartel dealer that are pretty bad people. But that's up the ladder a ways, I think. And I didn't see a whole lot of that with the run-ins that I had with people. And I started to realize that, like, a lot of people that my son were getting drugs from were like the kids of people that I knew that were also suffering with substance abuse problems, and they were just doing this to support their habit,
Right. Most drug dealers are this isn't totally true at all, but that so many are drug users. There's just everybody's dealing to everybody else to different degrees. But I did know some people that were fairly big in heroin and cocaine smuggling and stuff that had no problem themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And they were just sort of like, they were fairly normal people, know.
I think I know a couple of the same people you're thinking of.
Ethan Nadelman. I went to hear a talk by him in Pacific Heights, raising money with a room full of very wealthy people. One of them took me, and it was George Soros who who went to him, and Soros had read stuff he'd written. He used to work for the DEA, and really got into harm reduction. And harm reduction, he defined, as I recall, of reducing the harm from, taking drugs, and reducing the harm from the laws about drugs and the way drug users are treated by society and the law and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. You look around, when Micah was in his rehab program, and I went to visit him, and they had family day where you could go to visit. We realized that about 40% of the people there, I think, were there for alcohol, and about 40% were there from opiates, and then about the other 20% we're there for the whole mixture of everything else, you know, from benzos to cocaine to methamphetamine. But if you look at like the largest amount of the people there, it was opiates and alcohol. And it's kind of interesting how much differently we as a society look at alcohol, which is obviously a huge problem, but we accept it completely, where we, you know, tend to completely look down on the opiate user or the meth user so much more than the alcohol user.
Well, my experience is that heroin addicts were they weren't as disgusting as alcoholics.
Right. Right.
In
but
general,
society in general seems to think about.
Yeah.
Society in general seems to think about that the other way, even though, you know, in reality it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, right. No, and alcohol is the drug that's associated with violence the most.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's some people that really flip over into another sort of personality if they're drinking. They have 2 levels of that in Japanese. One is they have. If you go into some places that serve alcohol in Japan, particular type, I can't remember what, and most places serve alcohol, but I mean, they have food.
Right.
But they will have these 3 faces that are sort of like the face of comedy and tragedy, representing like Greek theater. There'll be a happy face, a crying face, and an angry face. And it's the happy face is ware jogo, and the crying face is naki jogo, and the angry face is okore jogo, and then there's shuran, and the shuran is somebody who becomes violent when they drink.
Yeah, it's very common. I mean, alcohol causes a lot of the fights, a lot of violence, a lot of, you know, I think by far the drug that's involved in the most the violence, when it doesn't come to, you know, dealer violence, that sort of gang violence.
Yeah. I knew a guy in Stinson who did, he was, what do you call it? The guys who ride in ambulances and then go help people wherever they're going, you know.
You mean a paramedic or EMT?
Yeah, EMTs. And so he was doing a CPR training at Green Gulch that I set up. And I knew him from the Sand Dollar in Stinson. And I asked him what, you know, he was talking about all the problems they run into going places, and there's actually a problem with, you know, people fighting and families, violence and stuff. I said, what percentage of alcohol abuse do you run into when you go somewhere and the problem is violence? He said all of it, 100%.
Yeah, I believe that. That's crazy.
Yeah. He also said they never saved anybody from CPR.
That's interesting.
Not never, but
it's only the perfect situation, right?
Yeah, and those electrical things that they use, those usually don't work. You know, you see it on TV and in the movies. They put them on people's heart. And you know, there was that show on TV. Wasn't it Emergency Room? Michael Crichton wrote it. What was it called? It was very big. ER, right. I didn't watch it. I remember reading that there's something like the AMA or something requested that ER stop showing that saving people.
The paddles, yeah. Well, I think the issue is that usually there's a reason why somebody's heart stops, right? So you can jumpstart their heart for a second, but if you haven't stopped the underlying reason of why it stopped, it's just going to stop again if you haven't dealt with that problem, you know?
Yeah. Hey, what? Go on.
Well, I don't know. You may have heard of this, but I thought this was something interesting that we started to learn about this recently. Is there was two incidences that I thought really kind of showed a lot about substance abuse. One was during Vietnam, they figured about 20% of the soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly while they were in Vietnam. And there was a big scare that all these people are going to come home and we're going to have this huge wave of heroin addicts.
That's
and
right.
They all came home, and the vast majority of them just stopped using heroin. They just quit.
I remember that.
And then the other experiment they did with rats is they put a rat in a cage and they'd offer them a water bottle with cocaine in the water and a water bottle that's just water. And the rat would tend to just use the cocaine until he died. But they realized their experiment was pretty flawed, so they did it again where they called it the rat utopia, where they made this wonderful place for rats, and there was lots of rats to play with, and there was toys for them and all kinds of different food. And so the rats were happy, and they just drank the water. They didn't drink the cocaine water. They pretty much left it alone. So it was really sort of showing how much of the substance abuse problem has to do with an underlying dissatisfaction with somebody's life or something that people aren't happy with, and they're looking for some way to ease their pain or change the way they're feeling.
Yeah, I'm aware of that too. And pardon?
Yeah. Well, I was that's why we try to talk a lot too about how a lot of these like substance abuse rehab programs that just take somebody in and they detox them and they get them off drugs and then they put them back out again. But if they haven't really dealt with the underlying problem of why somebody's abusing substances, that it's not likely to be very successful. If you're not looking at why is this person unhappy, why is this person like trying to self-medicate with these drugs at the same time,
This makes me think of that methadone clinic in Berlin because it was in the Turkish section. And the Turks in Germany are like Latin Americans in America. They tend to be looked at as an underclass or, they tend to be the people that do the lower level jobs. But in the and they're discriminated against. All right, so it was in the Turkish section of Berlin, which is a very cool section. It was really great. I go walk around. I go to work with him, and it had a lot of culture and it had a lot of heart. I loved it. Well, none of his patients were Turks. They were all like native Germans. And he pointed that out. He said the Turks have a really strong culture. But maybe that's not always true. I wonder about that here. What percentage, if you look at the Hinduism and the Islam,
interesting.
Which one? I would imagine the Muslims would have a higher rate. Although they can be very, very together. Too, but the Hinduism here on Bali with so many people, it's just so involving. And young people here are pretty wholesome.
Interesting.
You don't have to worry about them. You don't have to worry about young men here, and young men are traditionally one of the biggest problems with society.
Definitely.
All right. Well,
that's interesting.
All right. I want to ask you about growing up at around Zen Center. Of course, I was at your birth.
You knew me all the way through.
Your parents and Diane Goldschlag at the time, my wife, and I lived we sort of had a type of duplex at Green Gulch
It's a little
Farm,
duplex there.
all
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Ken built, the side you all were on. These were
Yeah.
bullpens, I guess you know.
Yeah, that's
for,
right. I
for
was born in a bullpen.
You were born in a bullpen. You were, and for George Wheelwright's prize bulls that were very
That's
big
right.
and very strong, and but both of which drowned in his his reservoirs that he built because they'd walk in and they couldn't get out.
Couldn't get out. Wow.
Anyway, your mother had a really long labor.
That's right.
I can't remember. It was like 35 hours or something.
Yeah. 36 hours is what she says.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. All right. I remember it. Yeah. And I think you were born 8 days before Kelly. You were born in the.
I think that's right.
That's right. You were born in the bullpen, but we hadn't moved in yet. Kelly was born in that room above the kitchen. If you go up the stairs there right away.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, and you had a lot of colic. You cried a lot.
I heard about that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the suffering I've gone through for you and how ungrateful you are. No. So, what was it like growing up around there?
Yeah, it was kind of great at the time. It was kind of wonderful to have the freedom to have a safe place to just explore and be a kid and be a boy doing, things out in nature. And I think the younger years were, in that sense of things were kind of great, kind of cool. Of course, when I was, I moved there from there when I was 8, so I was pretty young in the years that I was at Green Gulch itself. I think the one thing that I've always thought were sort of the hard part of growing up at Zen Center is that sometimes it doesn't quite prepare you for the real world. You have this sort of idealistic world that you're living in, which is really great if you stay in that world. But I had some pretty hard culture shock, when I jumped into the real world and started going to public school in San Francisco. That was a pretty tough school, not far from the Mission District, and I was sort of this naive kid from Zen Center that just thought everybody was going to be my friend and come play with me, and I got beat up quite a bit.
Is that right? Wow.
I did. Yeah, when we first moved to San Francisco, I would just kind of go out and play, and and my parents were kind of naive at the time and not sort of realizing quite what was there, and I'd kind of go out and play in the park and get beat up and come back all beat up and go, "Mom, those kids aren't nice."
Wow.
So it was there was a lot of interesting experiences, and I think there was a lot of good experiences, but also I think we all sort of realized that there's a little bit of not quite being prepared for the rest of the world, when you were sort of that protected and growing up in that sort of idealistic of a situation, and then you get thrown into sort of culture shock when you hit what the rest of the world is like, and not everybody's quite as nice. But, I think there was a lot of great experiences. That was sort of, but I remember that was always kind of a rough one. And then I sort of did the reverse rebelling from my parents sort of thing. I kind of went back to, we weren't strict vegetarians, right, when we were back then. But at Green Gulch, of course, and at Zen Center, we were vegetarians. But when we'd go out to places, we'd eat some meat here and there. But I remember my mom always tells the story about when we moved to San Francisco and I started getting an allowance. I saved up my first 2 allowances and I bought a steak. That was my reverse rebellion back to normal culture.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Yeah. Wow.
And I sort of never kind of followed the, religious spiritual aspect of it. And I'm not sure. I've often thought later in life why I never had any sort of interest. And I don't know if that was just sort of, again, the same thing of sort of, going the opposite direction or rebelling or what it was, But I've always had a pretty sort of like scientific, common sense sort of a brain, and I have a really hard time believing things if you can't prove it to me, sort of. Sort of thing.
Well, you shouldn't. You shouldn't.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's bullshit.
Have you ever seen the Bill Maher movie Religulous?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And I remember he's just got that line that, we all have it ingrained in our heads that faith is a great thing. And he has that line is like, why is faith good? Faith is believing in something even though there's no evidence it's true. Why is that a good thing?
Yeah. Well, Zen Center did not indoctrinate children. I mean, they didn't. There was no program to brainwash the kids.
Absolutely.
And, but it probably erred on the end of not giving them a good enough idea of what it was all about.
Completely.
But that's hard to do because the adults also were struggling with figuring out what it was all about.
What it's all about, of course. And I always appreciated that. I have, when you look at most other religions, you're pretty much from the time you're pretty young, you're indoctrinated, right? You do all your christenings and all your different whatever religious ceremonies when you're a kid, and by the time you grow up, you believe in that religion and you're not sure why, right? So I always really appreciated that. My parents and Zen Center in general, basically, I always felt like they wanted me to figure out what I believed on my own without being told or forced into what I should believe.
Yeah.
And I always appreciated that. I always thought that was by far the way to go. Now, I do think that the morality of what the Buddhism is and the morality of the people at Zen Center got instilled into me for sure, but without sort of the religious part of it. And a lot of the Zen Buddhism, right, it's hard to even say if that's quite a religion as much as it is a way of thinking and a way of living, right? It's like most Zen Buddhists, right, don't have this concept of necessarily a higher power or a god, right? It's more of a practice to follow.
Well, yeah, to me, it's not a system of belief, and it's a system of inquiry, but religions, and I use that in a sort of institutional sense, that people automatically start believing things, and the religions, but Buddhism was founded on really a very scientific approach of inquiry, and there were no statues. There was, there was meditation looking into into the nature of mind. There was, anyway, but there's plenty of Buddhism that I've seen that is just believing in a lot of superstitious stuff, and people no matter what the system of the religion or people will automatically start to create supernatural beings out of the teachers or the founders like Buddha. And to me, it's all myth. To me, all religious teaching is myth. There's none of it that is it's all something pointing at something deeper. And to me, belief is, well, there's a saying, one Tibetan guy that told me, there's a saying, belief is the first door. So it encourages you to take a look, but then you got to drop it. But it's always a struggle not to be not to be superstitious.
Right. Well, and I think that was I mean, in terms of most religions, that the Zen Center was pretty good at not, I mean, obviously there's always some of that, but I mean, other forms of Buddhism too, right? Tibetan Buddhism believes a lot more in the whole reincarnation thing and more of the superstition pieces of that, right? More than Zen Buddhism. Is that true? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that people into Tibetan Buddhism believe a lot more.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought too that, like, especially ancient religions was sort of society's way of keeping people from just killing each other, right? You know, you've got to have a punishment if you do bad things, right, and a reward if you do good things.
Right.
The heaven and hell. How do you keep, you know, ancient societies that don't really have a law enforcement factor from just slaughtering each other?
Right. Yeah, the sort of I call that the comic book version of reincarnation or of karma.
Right.
Like if you kill somebody, then in your next life somebody will kill you, and that sort of thing. It's,
exactly.
You know, I think cause and effect is something that's pretty hard not to believe in, but then trying to understand or codify what it means on a really big scale and in terms of all existence, to me it's all incomprehensible. I mean, I was just reading last night about the observatory up above Tassajara on the mountain, because I'm writing about some of that stuff there at Tassajara, and at what I read, it said what I had heard when I lived there, is that people there said it's one of the best places in the world to look at the stars. I'd hear there's less electrical activity. I'd hear the stars don't twinkle. Anyway, I was reading it, and I remembered looking with a giant telescope that somebody had trucked up to Chews Ridge, and they were showing me galaxies, you know, and I could actually see parts of the galaxies in the spiral arms. And then I was reading on that thing, and it was talking about galaxies, and then some of the really big galaxies. You know, galaxies can have hundreds of billions of stars. Some of the really big ones, it says, have trillions of stars. And I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking, you know, this is just completely incomprehensible. It's trying to understand this with your brain, which is like a tool to deal with practical issues. It's just hopeless.
Yeah, that's right. You're better off with understanding. You're not going to be able to answer the questions.
Yeah. Well, hey, one thing I remember is you like guns, and right, and you had something that kids shouldn't have. You had a realistic looking gun, right?
Interesting.
Do you remember this?
I'm trying to remember that. The biggest gun thing was Ethan. Remember Ethan Patchell?
Oh, sure. Oh, do I remember Ethan? Yeah.
Yeah. So he lived in the city before I did, and I used to remember Kelly and I and Ethan were all good friends.
Right.
And Ethan had more than us this sort of gun infatuation, and when we lived at Green Gulch, we weren't really even allowed to have, you know, toy guns to play with.
No.
I think we had some things that were like wooden looking, not realistic sort of guns that we would play with. But I remember one time Ethan coming to visit, and he had, like, you know, Rambo, you know, style whole collection of guns that he came with. And I remember Kelly and I just being sort of completely blown away and infatuated by all these, like, realistic toy guns that he had when he came out from, you know, because he was from San Francisco, and Kelly and I were there from Green Gulch, just sort of blown away by that. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what at that point then. So you know, when I got to be a teenager, I started doing a little bit of hunting, and that was sort of, again, I think my the things that I wasn't sort of allowed to be interested in when I was younger, I became very curious about.
Right.
And it didn't get too carried away, and it didn't like really last. And I remember I had always just had the, the hunting rifle version of things. And I always remember like the people that I knew that would get way into wanting to have the military rifle version of things, and just thinking how kind of carried away that was. But I still have, I inherited when my wife's father died, he had quite a few guns. And, when I hunted more when I was younger, I'd have a couple shotguns and a couple rifles and all that kind of stuff. And I still have them all locked away in a safe. But I mean, it's like, I think I pull something out and shoot it every 3 or 4 years now.
Oh, really? Really?
The ammunition that I have, I probably have to throw away from time to time because I never shoot anything.
You have to throw it away? Really? Ammunition goes bad?
I don't really, but that's always the joke because, like, it's made of brass, right? And as brass gets old, it tarnishes and gets kind of green and stuff like that.
I see.
It isn't bright and shiny anymore. So I always like, sometimes I'll look at some of the ammunition and go, God, I think I bought this 30 years ago. I wonder if it's
Wow. Well, look, I thought I have this memory, and it could be false, of you being stopped by the police, and I think it might have been in the hate. And because you were playing with, you were young, you weren't a teenager. And you had some gun that looked too realistic, and they did not like that. They felt that you were putting yourself in danger, right?
Yeah, I remember that. Now that you mentioned that, I remember that incident. And actually, that was a little pellet gun that I had. And the pellet gun completely broke, and I took all the guts out of the inside of it, so there wasn't even anything inside of it. And I used it like as a toy gun, which obviously, looking back at that now, was pretty stupid, of course, because it did look pretty realistic. And the cops saw me walking down the street, and I think it might have been Ethan and I and Kelly, not far from where Dia lived at the time.
Right.
Playing sort of cops and robbers or war or something down there in the Haight district, and cops saw me with that gun, and he kind of really freaked out. He put his hand on his own gun, and he yelled at me, and kind of drop it, sort of thing. And but it was a little pellet gun that was broken, so it didn't work anymore. The interesting thing too is I also had a pair of nunchucks when we lived in the city. We got kind of into like ninja weapons and throwing stars and that kind of crap. And I think I actually made a pair of nunchucks with a little piece of chain and 2 pieces of dowel that I put together, and I got stopped by the cops there. And the funny thing is they took them away, and they actually said that if I was a kid with a handgun, it would have been a misdemeanor, but a kid with nunchucks was a felony.
Is that right?
Yeah. So they took them away and said that if my parents wanted it, they'd have to come down and file a report at the police department, but we never did. We just...
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
I remember that.
Wow. Also, you all were somewhat into marijuana. I remember that.
Oh, yeah. We did start we got into marijuana, and we got into psychedelics at a pretty young age. That was sort of, I think when I think back on it now, I'm kind of amazed at sort of thinking I moved to San Francisco when I was 8, and we left when I was 14. So in that time period between 8 and 14, we were smoking a lot of pot, that's for sure. And then we were kind of also started getting into LSD and mushrooms a little bit. LSD was more available, I guess, like up on Haight Street.
Well, mushrooms, yeah.
So, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, for some reason we didn't have as much access to mushrooms. I don't know why, just the people we were hanging out with or whatever, but we had some good access. We had access to LSD. So at a pretty young age, in the 10, 12 years old, we started sort of experimenting with LSD.
Wow.
Which was interesting.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. I mean, LSD was very important to me, but, I had read about it, and I took it with the psychedelic experience as a guide, like meditating, fasting, not talking. I never liked the idea of taking it and screwing around.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Ethan used to tell his parents that he was staying at my house, and I'd tell my parents I was staying at Ethan's house. And I remember we'd go like drop LSD and go walk down missions in the Mission District and just hang out all night long, and then realize like neither one of us had a place to go home to because we both told our parents we were staying at the other one's house. So we'd like wind up sleeping in a doorway somewhere when our high was crashing.
Really? Oh, you could have gotten caught so easily.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean,
easy.
I would, one of them could call the other, how's Micah doing, or what? But
oh yeah,
would.
Well, communication was so much different back then too, right? We didn't have cell phones. We didn't text each other.
Yeah.
So phone calls were kind of a bigger deal, and I don't think you would like call your friend at 1 o'clock in the morning usually, and I don't think we could get away with it anymore today.
Ken did a survey of parents about what do you think about your kids smoking pot and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And he said the two most libertarian parents were me and Mayumi.
Interesting.
And I remember once when Elin and I were fairly new, maybe we'd only been together a couple of years or something, right? And maybe I was I don't know, the cook at Zen Center, the Tenso, taking you and Kelly and Micah to a movie. And, you all were about 11 or 12. And I stopped the car on the way. And I turned around and I said, all right, no pot, no movie.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And so we all smoked some pot and went to the movie. Now I'm not living in America now, so and I don't think Indonesia would extradite me for that. I don't even know if they do extradite people here.
My experience with pot when I started getting into smoking too much pot was like, I wasn't feeling like there was addiction to pot or that it was a massive problem, except for the fact is I started feeling like I was just being lazy and not accomplishing much. And that's sort of when I decided I needed to start smoking less pot just to have more energy and accomplish more things,
Yeah, I remember that. I remember you got more into it than Kelly.
Yeah. And then when I moved up here, when I was 14, I moved up here to Occidental and I just completely quit. I don't think probably from the time I was 14 till maybe 17, I don't think I smoked almost any pot at all. And then at 17, I started smoking just a little bit here and there. And ever since then, I've just, I smoke occasionally here and there, but not regularly.
I had periods when I was living in Bolinas and working on music or, I worked for Zen Center too a lot, where I smoked too much pot and where, like you say, it's not physically addictive, but I was smoking more really than I wanted to. And it was just, I've had a couple of periods like that where it was just too much and it was really sort of unpleasant. But, you get into these habits. But then I'd say, then mainly I just smoked very, very little. I would have a joint and, it would last 2 weeks.
Right.
Or something like that. And I was doing the same thing with tobacco. I'd have, a little tobacco in it. But then I figured out, basically I'm sort of strung out. So like, almost 20 years ago, I stopped doing anything except tea. I stopped coffee too.
Coffee. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I find that I don't really like pot socially anymore because I feel like I sort of become a zombie and I don't socialize very well. And I will sometimes smoke to help sleep, because I find that I have insomnia, and my brain I can't shut off my brain. It just dwells on shit while I'm laying in bed, and sometimes I'll smoke a little bit of pot just to help my brain stop.
Well,
going all over the place.
Yeah,
not very much, just a very small amount, just enough to relax a little bit.
Right, it is. I remember reading in Robert S. DeRopp's Drugs in the Mind, and he had a little community right near on Sonoma Mountain Road, right near Bill Kwong's Genjoji.
Oh, okay.
But I read Drugs in the Mind, when I was like 19, 20, and he said sleeping pills do not put you into deep sleep. He said the only drug that you can get into deep sleep with is marijuana. And I have been amazed at all the good press that marijuana has had, cannabis has had for all sorts of medical uses. And I'm very impressed. I don't personally, I think smoking a lot of pot all the time is not a good thing, right? I think a little bit is cool.
Yeah. It's interesting now, too, as I know a number of people that have sort of, with the potency of it and that have gotten carried away with too much, that have really sort of had, some substance abuse problems with pot that I didn't really expect earlier, but now I'm seeing a little bit more of it. And some people that have been using it really like to stay stoned all the time, to be mind altering for a number of years. And now that they're trying to come off of it, and it feels to me like what it is even though it's not as much of a physical addiction to the body, it's the fact that they've been perceiving things different, or maybe masking and hiding some of their real feelings for a long time. And now that they're trying to come off of pot, they're having these like super high levels of anxiety and real, craziness that they haven't felt in quite a few years, that all of a sudden these feelings are coming back strong and they're really struggling and having a hard time. I know of one person that's actually, their doctors prescribed them ketamine to help them get off pot, which was like totally blew me away. I'm like, whoa,
wow.
You're getting on a much heavier drug to try to stop doing pot. But I think it's because they were doing such sort of large amounts of strong pot for a number of years that it was just like coming off of it was just a completely new way of experiencing the world,
Yeah, I never liked getting too high on pot. I could have very strong pot, and there was very strong pot in the 60s. There were like Acapulco Gold and Panama Red. Some were very strong, and I would just want like one puff. I did not. I found getting too high on pot to be disorienting and could be very unpleasant. Like I couldn't keep up with what was happening. So
I feel the same way, and that's why I don't like it like as a social drug. And sometimes I'll like it when I'm just like alone, and you can just sort of zone out, and you don't have to keep up on anything.
Yeah. I liked it for music, but after a while, basically I'm just happy. I'm happy. I just like fresh air and sunshine. Really. And exercise.
But you also have that experience sometimes on different drugs. You pot a little bit, but like mushrooms sometimes, right, where you sort of feel like you figured the answers out to the earth, of course, or you had a mind-changing, incredible experience, and then later when you think back on it, like, did I really figure anything out, or was I just high and being stupid,
Yeah.
Which way was it?
Well, I'm not down on psychedelics. I don't want them, but I think psychedelics, I think some psychedelic use is good for people. It integrates the brain in ways that people who've taken psychedelics test out as overall better adjusted and happier than people who haven't.
Yeah. There's a lot of research happening now too, and I know some people actually. A lawyer that we built a house for, and his wife, whose son is an addict, that we've been trying to help their son out somewhat too. But they're really finding a lot of help with using psychedelics to treat opioid addiction.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of movement. There's a whole movement towards that now, and they're actually he's working on legislation to try to get it legalized for opioid addiction.
That's been true for, that there were people using LSD for heroin addiction and alcoholism back in the 60s. And, legislators, they can be awful stupid. Legislation can be sort of dumb, like when they outlawed marijuana, cannabis. They made it where you couldn't get hemp rope, hemp paper.
Exactly. And then, of course, they made it a Schedule 1 drug, right? Where heroin is a Schedule 2, and heroin's a Schedule 2 drug. You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's such a the war on drugs. It was political.
Disaster. Oh, absolutely.
Terrible.
Absolutely. It was a complete failure.
Well,
and it's interesting to me. It's like the biggest problem in society with drugs. If you're not talking about the negative effects on the addicts themselves, but in the rest of society, the biggest negative effect is the crime that goes along with it, And the crime is there because of this war on drugs that we've been having forever. So it's making the cost go up and making the cartels have the market. And if we could eliminate that part of it, it would be such a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what is Portugal legalized all drugs, right? But what do they do about fentanyl? What do you know?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, it may be the fact that because, the reason we're having the massive explosion of fentanyl here is it's cheap. It's what's available. I think a big part of the problem is because it's so potent. You can take a tiny package of it that has thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of doses, but super easy to smuggle. And part of what's happening now is people are even just ordering it through the mail. It's coming FedEx basically from China through the mail. So it's so easy to import and so easy to smuggle. And I think that's part of why the explosion of it is happening. And I wonder in Portugal, I want to research that more. That's a good question. And I wonder, like, for instance, if morphine or heroin were, is easy to get and as cheap, if fentanyl really just wouldn't be a problem. Because like right now, I know of addicts around here that would like to use heroin and they're scared of fentanyl, but they just can't find heroin anymore. It's not available. So they're sort of forced to use fentanyl because that's all that's available. So if you had a legal source of controlled dose, pharmaceutical, I'm not sure, pick what's the safer version of, morphine or heroin or something that was available to all these addicts, would they stop using fentanyl? I kind of think that they might, or at least people wouldn't start using fentanyl in the first place.
Yeah. Well, amazing.
Because I know a number of heroin addicts that, like, when fentanyl was taking over, they were really just trying to find heroin and really trying to stay away from fentanyl, and eventually they just gave up and said they just couldn't find heroin anymore, so they had to switch to fentanyl.
Well, it's complex issues. Seem to be very well informed. You must keep studying up and on it. Am I right?
Yeah, I find out. We study up on it, and we try to read up on the latest things that have happened. But we also find a lot just by working out in the community and doing a lot of the outreach stuff that we do and talking to some of the different populations. And I've done Narcan trainings in homeless encampments in Oakland, and then here in Rohnert Park in Santa Rosa, or Sebastopol, where we'll go in. And we've done 2 Narcan trainings at funerals in homeless encampments where somebody had just passed away and their family asked us to come and, distribute out Narcan to all their friends that are addicts at the funeral. And so a lot of times talking to there's 2 different groups that I usually do trainings for. One is sort of the addicts and the homeless population. And then the other, of course, are just the average person who's like parents that are worried about their kids and they don't know much about it. So, of course, the parents and that sort of those groups of people, they don't know a lot. And I'm really teaching them a lot of stuff and teaching them what's going on and teaching them what to look out for out there. And then when I do the trainings for the homeless and the real addict communities, it's almost the opposite. They're really teaching me. Like, there's not much that I'm teaching them anymore because they're on the front lines of this. And most of them, I mean, when I do these homeless trainings, most of the homeless people, addicts that I work with, know exactly what Narcan is. They know how to use it. They've used it on their friends, and they've had it used on them already to save their lives. So they know all about it. So I learn a lot from talking to them of what's the latest thing that's happening, what are the latest things on the streets to look out for. I don't know if you've heard now, but there's a whole new scare, which is actually really scary. It's called Trank is the street name for it. Oh, God, what's the real name? Oh, xylazine is the actual name. It's a new drug that's out right now. It's a horse tranquilizer. It's not an opioid, so the problem is Narcan doesn't work on it to bring you back from an overdose, but it is a tranquilizer, so it has similar effects, and people are overdosing on it. And the other problem it has is it becomes necrotic. So when you're injecting, if somebody's using it intravenously, the site that they inject into, the tissue around the site starts to die, and they're getting these really bad, nasty sores around the tissue. So
ouch.
That's the newest thing that's happening. That's really scary that we're starting to see. And I think it's happening in the larger cities like San Francisco. It's getting really big right now, and then it starts to spread out into the smaller communities around from there.
Well,
so that's the kind of stuff that I learned more about from, the population of real addicts that are starting to use it and see it and having those side effects. And then from there, I can take that information and try to teach the parents and the kids and the people that are, hopefully trying to keep them safe from not getting to that situation. And we've been a little bit discouraged in trying to work with the real addict community because it just feels kind of, hopeless, because, and it's not completely hopeless, but when you work with so many people and don't see a whole lot of success stories, it becomes kind of frustrating. And that's part of why, we still work with those communities, of course, but we're also really trying to work with younger people and trying to catch people before they get to that point to really give them some tools to try to help them from getting that carried away. And whether those tools are just knowing what's there to completely avoid or knowing how to be safe with what they do experiment with.
Well, that certainly makes sense that you move you move what you're doing to places where it's more effective with younger people. Yeah,
that's the hope.
Yeah.
We talked to one guy that's, had Narcan used on him like 10 different times, and he wants a whole bunch of Narcan, and I gave him Narcan and stuff, but you also feel frustrated about the fact that, like, boy, that's unfortunate that's not what I was hoping the use of this product was, is that there's some people now that they're using more opioids because they feel comfortable with the fact that if they overdose, that you can use Narcan to bring themselves back from an overdose. So now they feel comfortable using stronger and more opioids. So it's like, oh, that's an unfortunate side effect.
Oh, wow. I remember with, you know about Terry Gregg and all that, right?
That was one of the names. That's one of the names I thought you were talking about earlier.
Well, Terry was, Terry was involved with a pretty big, some of the people, he was a lower level heroin smuggler, but some of the people they were involved with, there were higher level. And anyway, but, it ended up killing him. But actually, he ended up committing suicide.
Right.
And because he'd come to the end, the feds all knew who he was. He couldn't, and nothing was working for him anymore. And he just got depressed. Actually, it was depression that killed him. It was too bad. But anyway.
And then he was working with Renee Pate, right?
Renee went with him on one trip.
Is that what it was? Yeah.
And got busted. I mean, Renee was out of control. And another guy I know that went on one of Terry's trips.
I worked with Renee for a while.
Oh yeah. Well, he's an interesting guy. Yeah. I always stayed close with him, but he had a demonic side. that was
Yeah,
like another
yeah.
personality that would get violent.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
he got off of rape and kidnapping in San Francisco, and I know he was
Mm-hmm.
guilty, and I know he
Oh,
had a
wow.
gun, and,
Yeah.
and I knew who the woman was. And in Florida, when after he'd served, like 8 years or something for a certain number of years from being busted for smuggling with a kilo of heroin in the Hawaii airport in Florida where he
Yeah.
was living, he got arrested for rape and kidnapping. Kidnapping just because you're not letting somebody move,
Holding somebody.
right?
Yeah.
And he went to prison for that for, I don't know, he was like in prison for 20 years. And
Oh my God. No.
Renee he had people frightened of him around Zen
Yeah.
Center. And some of these people were people who dealt with, dealt with tough people.
Yeah.
There were people who did not want, who told me, if my name comes up with Renee, change the subject. And these were people that dealt with tough people, or dealt with, or who were other drug dealers or something. But Renee stopped drugs. He got, when he finally got out, he was in a motorcycle accident, and he wouldn't let them give him any painkiller at the hospital.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But Zen Center put out a thing where he couldn't get near Zen Center.
Oh, wow.
When he came back, his lawyer told him Zen Center had, put out a, where you can't go to their property. And I knew he was coming back, and I tried to get Zen Center to relate to him, to talk to him or something. They didn't do anything. They just to his lawyer. But, and so he said, because when he first came back, he didn't tell anybody and just came to Green Gulch. And I knew he was coming, and I tried to get them to deal with him. And so he sat with Clay and me. That's, like 20 years ago or something. He sat with Clay and me there for a spring, one of these events where it's all big public. Well, everybody in Zen Center was all freaked out, right? And that's when he got his lawyer got the letter. And then he said, I can't go to Zen Center. I can't go anywhere. He said, I guess they know why I was in prison. I said, no, Renee, that's not why. He said, well, why? I said, it's because you threaten people's lives. He said, what? What are you talking about? He didn't know.
No. Didn't even realize, remember.
Multiple people had told him, I know where you live, He'd been he was chasing after Tigan with a gun. Tigan had to go hide. He didn't remember any of that. It was like he had a split personality. But anyway, I'm off on
Well, I worked with him, in construction. He was working for Peter Vandestier when I was working for Peter right after he got out for the stint that he did for the heroin smuggling. So I worked with him for, 6 months or something after he got out for that heroin smuggling.
He was clean then. He was clean.
Yeah, he was clean, but he was pretty rough. He was pretty crude, and we always kind of remember having to tell Renee, like, just calm down. I mean, that's sort of just like the way he would talk and the language he would use around clients was a little bit like out of control.
Yeah.
We would always say like that. We had two carpenters that were working there, and the one carpenter would always say, "Hey, we just need to cut a whisker off this board," and Renee would always say, "Hey, we need to cut a cunt hair off this board." Sort of
right. Well, Steve Stuckey, the sort of most upright and solid of Zen students and teachers, Renee lived with him. He let Renee rent a room from him. And then, once he comes in, and this is later, and he found Renee shooting up. And he said, Renee, you agreed you wouldn't take any drugs. He said, yeah, but it's the weekend.
Well, that sounds about
right. And then, so they came to some agreement. Steve was unbelievably tolerant of his kids too, and you never know it because he was so strict with himself. But then, all right, another time he sees Renee. He's talking to Renee. Renee's on his way out, and Renee straps a gun on, right, like a shoulder thing. And Steve says, Renee, you can't live. What on earth are you doing with a gun? He said, well, I got to have protection. It's just, he lived, Renee's world and Steve's world, they were so far apart. So Steve said, well, you've got to go. You can't stay here and do that.
Well, I dealt a lot when my son was, going through his, substance issues and, the different deals he'd make. And there was always sort of an excuse, an arrangement, a reason, like you said, well, it's the weekend sort of a thing, And there was many times when I was trying to work with him that I'd let him live with me, but only if he was in a program and only if he tested and those sort of things. And he'd always have something. And I realized at one point too that he would actually keep clean pee in a little vial on him so that if you ever tested him that he would have, clean urine to give a clean test at any time. And he would always have that on him. And these are times when I didn't really realize that he was using it at the time because he was pretty good at hiding it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why I got into that Renee thing. There was some reason. What was it? We were talking about who Terry smuggling. I know why. I wanted to say something about what Terry did. I set up an intervention for Terry at Yvonne Rand's house. And there were about 20, maybe 30 people there. And so Terry agreed. We had a guy there, and Terry had plenty of money. Guy there took him off to a drug rehab. And Terry said, he'd pay for it. And he did it. And then Terry found out that drug rehab was great. He could clean up and everything and then start taking a lower amount. And he started, every once in a while, he just put himself in a drug rehab. He did this a few times. And then he told me he'd say, when it was about time to leave, he'd say to one of the people there, how much do you work? How much do you get paid for working here? He'd tell me, he said, how would you like to make $10,000 this weekend for working for 1 hour?
Yeah.
And so he started hiring people out of the drug rehab. Right? He did it a couple of times because he couldn't carry anything. Because they knew him. And his lawyer was a neighbor of mine in Belena's, probably the most famous drug lawyer in the country, Tony Serra. And Tony told me that the feds said, they knew who Terry was. They knew what he was doing. They said, but, guys like that, they die. He's not going to live that much longer. They weren't even trying to do anything about it.
Wow.
And they were right. Yeah.
Yeah, they were right. He was like in over his head, but not connected enough to be like cartel, right? He was.
Yeah, no. He just did what he did. He wasn't. He had people screw him. He'd never ever have been violent.
Well, yeah.
He just, he'd tell me, this person cheated me out of 75,000. There's nothing. He wouldn't do anything.
Right.
And also, he wouldn't have robbed anybody or anything. If actually, when he died, he owed me money. He'd stopped dealing and everything. And he owed me $400 when he died after running through, well over $1 million. Oh, God. Well,
that's too bad.
Yeah. So, listen, I'm really impressed with what you've done. Now, I want to put at the first of this podcast how people find the work you do, which is Micah's Hugs, and Micah is you're Micah, and your son was Micah Jr. Mikah, right?
That's Micah.
Oh yeah, no, that's what I meant. I'm sorry. You know why? It's because Indonesian C is cha. And, only a K is the K sound. Micah's Drugs, Micah. Micah's Hugs.
Micah's Hugs is it's our website is probably the best thing to look at. micahshugs.com.
Yeah, micahshugs.com. And are you on Facebook?
The Facebook is a little bit different. We have a memorial page on Facebook that's a little bit different than the Micah's Hugs. That's just Micah's name itself. But we do have an Instagram, Micah's Hugs Instagram.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we have both. It's mostly the website and the Instagram. The Facebook page is kind of more for his friends and family, just sort of memorial stuff for him. It's kind of different than what we're doing with the Micah's Hugs program from there.
Did somebody else start it, or did you start it?
We started it, but we started it right after Micah passed away, before we had the Micah's Hugs idea or concept going. So it was just more started for a place for people to share memories of him or share. It was kind of nice too that a lot of his friends could post videos that they had that I hadn't seen before. So I really sort of appreciated some of the stuff that his friends had on their phones that they'd post on there that I hadn't seen before. And part of the thing with him that we're trying to sort of help and share with people is that he was captain of the football team for 2 years in a row when they had their biggest winning streak at his high school. And he was one of the most popular kids in school. And he actually broke the weightlifting competition record at Henley High School. He was the strongest kid at the school. And he was, everybody thought super successful and had so much stuff going on. And it's like towards the end of there, he was struggling with a heroin addiction at the same time. So, part of the message that we're trying to get across is that, an addict isn't necessarily who you think they are, and trying to sort of break that stigma of people sort of assuming they know what an addict is or what an addict looks like. And also getting people to understand that, so many parents that we oh, not my kid. My kid would never do that sort of a thing, sort of a concept. And, there's the addicts that we're running into now are all sorts of people, not just who you might think an addict is.
Yeah.
And he was an amazing kid. He touched people's hearts in really sort of amazing ways. And that was sort of at his funeral that we had lots of people that got up and talked at his funeral. And sort of the biggest thing that people said is how much they were going to miss his big bear hugs. And that's where we got the name of Micah's Hugs, for our nonprofit, is because they said they were just going to miss his hugs so much. And, we did it at a big funeral home, and we had, the streets were lined outside the funeral home for blocks. And there was just so many people wanted to come and just sort of see that, because he did touch so many people. And when he passed, I was in a family support group, talking with other parents of addicts at the time. And when he passed, the other people in the support group said, if we could ask one thing of you, it would be not to hide this and to talk about it and be open about it and share this experience. And, that really sort of hit me and got me to sort of really not hide it from the beginning and be open and want to talk about it. And it's a big part of starting this whole thing. It's kind of really helped me deal with my grief, because I went through some pretty dark times after he passed away, and it was a struggle. And I started having panic attacks, which I had never experienced before. So it was sort of a whole new thing for me, having these panic attacks. And during one of my panic attacks, I took myself into the emergency room and sort of just said, hey, I need help. And this is fucked up. And so they actually put me on a suicide watch, and I wound up spending 5 days in a psych ward after that, which was very unhelpful, and realized that whole process is pretty fucked up as well.
Wow.
It's kind of their way of just covering their ass for liability so they don't get sued for locking you up so you can't hurt yourself for 5 days.
Yeah.
Going from there, but I was trying to find healthier ways, and I started drinking too much and just sort of self-medicating myself, and trying to find healthier ways to deal with the grief. And this has been a pretty good one, sort of helping other people and sort of spreading this, spreading the information that we have around has really helped me deal with my grief in a more positive way. Unfortunately, it was kind of a negative experience. I was hoping at least when I got locked up in the psych ward sort of thing that I'd at least had some positive takeaways from it. And I tried to say, okay, I'm here, I'm stuck here. There's nothing I can do about it. Obviously, what positive I can take away from it. And there were some positive things and some people that I met and stuff like that. But, a lot of it, you realize you're just kind of being shipped around. And I remember there was a counselor in there that, like the fourth day I was there, I finally met with a counselor who was this, Christian woman counselor that basically just tried to tell me to, put my faith in God and everything will be okay. Like, oh God, great. She's not going to help me much. So it was, unfortunately just like being housed for a while.
Yeah. Well, I had one experience with that, and your father was involved with getting someone into a psych ward, and really to protect him. He was going to get killed by the cops. And I felt it was very effective because I felt like he thought after that, I ain't going back there. I'm not going to get that out of it again.
There's that piece of it. But there were some people there that were really kind of suicidal that came really looking for help, and they were pretty disappointed, by the time they left, that they didn't feel like they'd gained much help except for, putting some. And, I kind of went in initially, and I told them, like, I've been drinking too much, and I'm trying to, I'm self-medicating, and I want these anxiety attacks that I'm having, and I need to find a healthier way to deal with it. And I was looking for some maybe better medication at the time, and by the time I left at the end of this whole period, they still haven't given me any medication or done much for me in any way. And I just thought, like, how disappointing that, I thought at least they would come out the other side of this with some better medication or better techniques of dealing with this anxiety and this depression. And I did eventually, but it was like that piece of the process didn't really help that much.
Well, so when Micah died, how long was it before you started Micah's Hugs?
It was probably about, it's hard to say because it's like, it was a slow process, right? We sort of started, when Micah first passed away, his ex-girlfriend and his best friend came to his funeral, and they were both, obviously using at the time. They were not clean. And then after his funeral, they disappeared, and their family couldn't find them. For 3 months, they were gone, completely missing. And they were, 22 years old at the time. And so Michelle and I, the first sort of thing that we did was about 3 months after the funeral. And this wasn't Micah's Hugs at the time, but this was the first thing we started doing to see if we could help in some way. And we sort of made it a mission of ours to sort of see if we could find them and just where they were at. So we started sort of just looking on social media and asking around, and we heard some rumors and different things. And we ended up finding them in a homeless tent encampment in Oakland, right across from Oakland Kaiser, in a park across from Oakland Kaiser. And we found them there and tried to see if we could, help out in any way. And they kept saying, they want help and they want to get clean and they'll be ready next week. They'll be ready next week. They'll be ready next week. And as far as I know, they're still in a homeless tent encampment in San Francisco now. They moved from Oakland to San Francisco.
Really?
And that's sort of the first thing we started doing. Obviously, we didn't have the foundation established at that time. It wasn't called Micah's Hugs, but that was shortly after that. My wife and I talked about, like, okay, what could we do to help these people? And it was this homeless encampment. I would say there was about 35 people. They were all opioid addicts, and I thought they were all sort of heroin addicts at the time. And that was my first idea. I said, okay, let's get fentanyl test strips, because Micah died of fentanyl that was in his heroin, and I don't think he knew there was fentanyl in his heroin. I think he thought he was smoking black tar heroin at the time. So I kind of thought, well, what can I do? Maybe I can help some of these other kids stay away from fentanyl. So we went and we bought fentanyl test strips, and we took them down to this homeless encampment in Oakland and said, hey, look, we've got these test strips. You guys can test, your heroin and make sure. And they all sort of looked at me and they were like, well, hey, well, thanks a lot, but we're all doing pure fentanyl now. We know it's fentanyl. We can't even find heroin anymore. So, thanks for your test strips, but they're not going to help much. So that's when we started sort of looking for different things and what can we do? How can we help? Where can we help? And, we're trying to keep it pretty, flexible. So as the need changes, what we're doing changes. And it looks like they're taking the prescription, aspect of the Narcan away, and they might even start making Narcan free. And maybe we won't have to do what we're doing anymore. So we'll morph it into something different. But I would say it was probably about 6 months to a year when we really started, trying to turn it into something and talking about establishing a nonprofit. And I think our official nonprofit took a couple of years before we actually had the license and all the proper paperwork and all that kind of stuff going. But it was pretty soon afterwards that we started doing this kind of stuff. And my wife, Michelle, is, she's always been really into community service and she's the head of our local 4-H, and she always pushes community service a lot with the kids in our local 4-H. And her girls have done a ton of community service, and they've won the Jefferson Award for community service with KPIX and the San Francisco 49ers Community Service Award, and they work with the homeless a lot. So it was kind of a perfect fit with her and with Micah passing of us turning this, what we've done into something. And that's kind of, actually, we were this morning, my wife in 2 weeks, she's donating a kidney to somebody that needs a kidney.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're in UC San Francisco for half the day this morning, getting the final testing all done and getting ready for the operation in 2 weeks from now. So
oh, my God.
Donating,
pretty serious.
She's donating one of her kidneys to somebody that she went to high school with that needs a kidney. So,
wow.
So we've just sort of taken that, and we've gotten, quite a bit of attention lately from, media attention, and won the local Press Democrats Spirit Award, and we've been on the local radio station a number of times being interviewed, and it's starting to sort of push things that way. But it was the whole Micah's Hugs thing was kind of a slow growth where we just started little things here and there until we could figure out what was needed. We've done now that we've raised money to pay for 30 scholarships for people to stay for 6 weeks at a sober living environment. We've donated to pay for people to go to detox and things like that. And we just sort of jump in when we see what we can do. We've gotten to the point where I've, worked with people enough and that people kind of trust me when they hear my story. So I've had things like, we had a friend of a friend called us up because their daughter, who's 21, disappeared to Spokane with a guy and was drinking a handle of vodka a day for the last 2 weeks in a hotel there. And the mom flew up and couldn't get her home because she actually tried to get her on the plane, and they wouldn't let her on the plane because of the way she was acting, trying to bring her home, and they couldn't figure out how to get her home. So Michelle and I jumped in the car and drove to Spokane and picked her up and brought her home. And it's like, just understanding the concepts a little bit better and knowing how to work with people that are in this situation and getting them to trust you and come home in the car with you, and when they're fighting with their parents, or her mom was up there kind of screaming at her to not touch another drop of alcohol. And I kind of went, the problem you have right here is this kid's been drinking a handle of vodka for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and you can't just shut her off instantly. And I know this is going to be counterintuitive to you, but we're going to go to the liquor store and we're going to buy her a bottle of alcohol to get her home. We're going to try to, moderate it in some ways so it's not completely out of control. But, she can actually die if you just cut her off after those levels of drinking. So,
Well, that's a voice of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you learn, and I learned a lot through my own experience. And I did the same thing with my son in the beginning, where I just thought, my first concept when I first found out Micah was doing heroin and he was in a pretty bad spot, and I brought him home and he detoxed on my couch here. I went out in the streets and bought black market Suboxone, which is, Suboxone is the drug that helps you get through withdrawals and detox from opioids. And, I had him on the couch. And at that time, I still had this concept in my head that, like, once he gets through this physical addiction, his body's not hooked on physically addicted to heroin anymore, then he should be fine. He'll be okay. Then you start to realize just how much more difficult and how much more complicated it is than that. There's so many more underlying. Have you read the book or seen the movie A Beautiful Boy?
Oh, no, but we should.
Okay, so so it's really interesting because they are a family. I think you'd really find it interesting. They're family they live in Point Reyes now, but they grew up a lot in San Francisco, and I believe they actually lived in Bolinas for a while. His son, Steve Carell, the comedian, actually plays the father in the movie, but he plays a really serious role and does an amazing job of it, actually. And that movie, A Beautiful Boy, when we watched it, that was before Micah passed when we watched that, and it was so parallel to the experience that I was having with Micah. And we actually met the real father and son at one point, and I was talking to the son, and he told me that he went to rehab 10 times before he got clean. And the last time he was in rehab, the person asked him, like, what's your mental health diagnosis? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I never had a mental health diagnosis. And they were, 10 times in rehab, and he's never had a mental health diagnosis. So they actually gave him a real mental health diagnosis and determined he was pretty severely bipolar. And they got him on the proper bipolar medication, and he's been clean for 10 years.
Oh,
after
really
failing
interesting.
10 times.
That's really interesting.
So he had this real underlying mental problem that he was self-medicating with opioids.
Wow. So now, how has your mental health progressed? I mean, you were grieving so much, and you were talking about, self-medicating, panic attacks. How did that? To me, I can think of no better medicine than service. So how are you personally? I mean, how do you feel now? How did your state of mind evolve?
Yeah. So it's been really something, and I think part of the hard part that I had in the beginning is I don't think I really allowed myself or even understood that the grieving was as severe and intense as it was of losing a child like that. And I just sort of, I think that I just expected myself to get over it quickly and to get back to being my old self, and went back to work pretty quickly, which was sort of disastrous and didn't work very well. I couldn't concentrate at work. I couldn't get much done, and ended up having to take more time off. And I think one of the hardest things that I found is I was trying to get back to being the same person that I was before Micah Pat died quickly, and being as motivated and being as ambitious as I was at work quickly. And the problem that I was having is things just weren't that important to me anymore. I didn't give a shit about a lot of these things that I used to care about more. And that was sort of hard to deal with, because a lot of I'm building these really exquisite homes for really rich people that are really finicky and really nitpicky. And we're sitting there spending a week coming back multiple times looking at 4 or 5 different shades of white to pick which white we're going to put on the wall. And I found myself just going, I don't give a fuck. Just pick one. Who fucking cares? They're almost the same shade of white, and there's so many more important things in this world than that fucking shade of white. And that became a little difficult for me. And I think what's finally helping me some now is sort of just coming to the conclusion and the understanding that I don't think I'm ever going to be that person ever again. And I'm having to sort of accept that and having to be okay with the fact that I won't be. And I'm having to accept the fact that I'm going to slow down a little bit, and I'm going to, as they say, smell the roses a little bit more. And I'm never going to be quite as driven or quite as ambitious as I used to be. And I'm going to have to stop and take a break when I need to just, mellow out and not get overly anxious. And that's been helping, but it's a process. And I would say, honestly, my second year, I would say, was almost harder than my first year of this, which I never expected. I thought, that I'd be over all this the second year, but there's sort of a feeling like the first year of going through things that you've got all this support, you've got all this help, you've got everybody's understanding, everybody's there for you, and all the first experiences that you go through are hard, but everybody's sort of understanding it. And sort of by the second year, you kind of feel like now everything's supposed to be fine. Everything's supposed to be normal. Nobody's quite understanding this anymore. And I'm supposed to just be fine and back to. And I really had a hard time the second year, just trying to. And I felt like it was about year 3 is when I started to be able to feel like the beginning of year 3 was when I started to be able to feel like, I could start to function a bit more normally, and my life was a bit more normal, and I wasn't just constantly. There was an interesting thing that Joe Biden actually said, because he's lost children as well too.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting thing that he said about the loss of his son, and when he was talking to other people who had lost their children, which I thought kind of made sense, is that, you'll never get over it. You'll never stop grieving, but there'll become a time when the thought of your child will bring a smile to your face before it brings a tear to your eye.
Mm.
And I thought, yeah, that's really interesting. That's really true, because there was a long period where I couldn't think about Micah without just being really sad and devastated, and then there became a point where I could think about fond memories of him and sort of smile when I thought about him, and that was interesting once that happened. But it took a long time, a lot longer than I expected. I wasn't prepared for, for grief to be physical. There's periods where I felt like I just physically couldn't even get up out of bed, no matter how hard I physically tried. Why, fuck it. And I kind of wasn't prepared for that to be that, have that big of an impact. It almost felt physical, not just emotional and mental, but physical.
Yeah. How long has it been since Micah died?
It's been a little over 3.5 years.
Wow. Is that all?
Yeah.
3.5 years. Wow. You've done a lot. You've done a lot in 3.5 years. I think you've put your ambition, your ambition, your motivations in a different direction.
Yeah, there's something to that too. But there's even times when I get overwhelmed and I just can't. We get on a project and we push it for a little while, and then I just get overwhelmed and I have to just sort of put it on the back burner for a little while and not think about it for a week, and then come back to it because I just get sort of overwhelmed or too emotional, those sorts of things. But there is something to that for sure. Yeah.
Well, people involved in service burn out. And you have more motivation than some people, but I'm sure you have to take care of yourself first. But what you're doing is really good, because you're creating. You have a program, and you're aiming your work in a direction where there's a vacuum, where there's a real need for it. And I think the service is very good if you're doing something that everybody else is doing, like working in a soup kitchen or something like that. But what you're doing has a creative aspect to it, and you have a lot of intelligence and knowledge, and I just think you ought to keep doing that. And to me, when I think about working with Ken and the contracting and stuff, that's just sort of like, I don't know what it really is. This is the way I see it. That's like therapy for you, getting out and doing something physical and all that, but it's not important anymore.
Yeah,
it gets you money.
And it's actually not even physical anymore. I haven't swung a hammer in 20 years. I'm either doing site meetings or I'm on a computer. That's my job. It's not even physical anymore.
Yeah.
And it's pretty stressful contracting and constantly dealing with it. And there's parts of me that think sometimes, is there a way I could actually make a living by doing the Micah Hug stuff and sort of retire from the contracting thing, because it gets pretty stressful. There's times when I just feel overwhelmed by the stress.
Yeah.
But at this point, it's a pretty good living, and it's hard to do the other sorts of things. There's a lot of different things I think of like, what could I do instead? And you always have to deal with the fact that I'd make half as much money doing any of the other things that I could think of, but I've definitely thought about okay, what's the point in life, and what are the lifestyle changes that it would take to be able to survive on half as much money?
Yeah, well, Kelly was at a pretty high level in the wine business, Right.
Right.
And he was being offered the whole West Coast by the biggest distributor in the country. And he quit it. You know, like after 10 years or something, he quit it. He was really, really good at it. But he quit it to earn a third as much with a tree trimming business.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes
then his tree trimming business evolved into something which made him a lot more than the why, but he didn't plan it that way, so you don't know what'll be ahead for. Wow. Well, well, anyway, I'm very impressed. Look what you've done in this short a time.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good. And
a big chunk of it, I've got to give to my wife, Michelle, too. You know, she's really been my support through this whole thing. And like, you know, obviously I have to give myself some credit too. But I mean, she really is the carrying such a big load in this thing too. And she's really driven a lot of it. So she's been my support through this thing.
Right. Well, I think of Micah's hugs as being Micah Sr., you, and Michelle. And Michelle's his stepmother. What about Denise?
Yes, that's it. My daughter's actually engaged right now. She's getting married, and so you know we can still, like, she's having an engagement party. She invited us to, so we'll go to that. So we're not, you know, we can do things like that together, and we can be around each other. But we realize it's just, or at least I realize that it's a lot less stress. So she's very sensitive, very emotional, and very controlling. And I was spending a lot of time and effort and energy tiptoeing around her emotions and trying not to upset her and trying not to piss her off. And at some point, I just realized it was too much of my own energy and my own stress to tiptoe around her that way. So we're kind of better off if we just don't communicate as much, and we don't hate each other, but we don't have to talk a lot at the same time.
Yeah. Well, that's, I didn't want, this is a really good podcast, but I'll cut that part out. But it's,
please thank you.
I just wanted to know. Well, don't worry. Yeah. You know, one thing, I'm doing, these days is, I'm transcribing the podcast with artificial intelligence. It's just,
oh my God,
you know, and voice recognition is so good now. It'll get, you know, like 98% of what you say is right, and that's a new voice. And before you had to like train a voice, and so I can scan now, not have to listen. At first when I was doing podcasts, and I've done a few hundred of them with people, you know, at first I would listen to the whole thing, and I'd like, you know, make sure there was, you know, I'd take out glitches and anything they said that, like, I knew they wouldn't want other people to hear, or something that was said that was unkind about somebody. But then I figured out I'd just make a note when I was doing it. You know, it's at, 43 minutes and 20 seconds, there's a cough, or they, just go there. But now I don't have to do that. I just transcribe it and I scan down it and go, here's the part he talks about Denise. And then it makes two files. It makes one that's just text, and the second one that has the text with the seconds. You know, I can go to the fraction of a second for anything. So I just, on the second one, I go, Denise. I just search for Denise. Then it says, it's so and so. Then I go to it. And, but first I mark an XX for where to start cutting, and then a YY to where to end cutting. And I just go to those points. So I can do it like so much quicker now. And, anyway, well, that's really good. I've really enjoyed talking with you. I'm very impressed.
Thank you, David.
Don't burn yourself out. I think you've got a I think you ought to just keep doing this and
Yeah.
filling in that a vacuum as well. What about, oh, there is one thing. What about teaching teachers? What about, what you're doing is important. And to what extent are you passing on your knowledge and everything to other people to do this sort of work?
Yeah, so that's something that's been coming up more just recently. We haven't done a lot, but we've been having like a lot of people that are, liking what we're doing and been asking what they can do to help and how they can get involved. And so far we haven't really done much of that yet, but it's sort of our next thought of where we want to be heading, because we have had so many people want to help and want to get involved. And, Michelle and I are just people that sort of jump in and do stuff. And I think that's another way of thinking about it that I think is helpful that we want to go to next. We didn't talk about that but we actually made a film about Micah and about addiction. And we got it. We hired somebody to make this film who got all the video done and as he was starting to put things together, he got overwhelmed. His business sort of took off in a different direction, and he was having a hard time getting all the B-roll and the stuff to do the final editing. So he's actually kind of turned it over to us. He gave us a hard drive with all these hours and hours of interviews that he did with people and places that we've gone and different, people in recovery that he's talked to and friends of Micah's that he's talked to about a whole bunch of things in interviews. So we want to finish putting this film together and sort of take that around when you said about, teaching. And part of what we want to do with that is take it around to schools in the area and sort of show it to the kids. And part of what we want to do with that too is get some of the younger people that have gone through recovery or, have been part of the process to help us present this film to some of the kids so they can be, talking to somebody that's closer to their age that's gone through what maybe they're going through or maybe what we're hoping they don't go through at the same time. And those are people that we'd like to sort of maybe pull into our project to get them working with us and talking to kids and talking to teachers at the schools when we start trying to show this film. And actually just last week, I contacted the head of at Anley High School, which is a high school here in our town. I contacted the guy that does the video program. He's teaching all the kids how to, shoot videos and edit stuff. I talked to him to see if they'd be interested, and he's really interested. And he says he's got some kids that he thinks would be really interested in trying to help me finish putting this film together. So getting some high school kids involved and doing the B-roll and doing the editing on this film to put together to help show around high schools, I think might be a good way to start pulling other people in.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot of work, working on film, working on video.
Yeah. Like I said, we hired somebody to do it, and it was going pretty good. And then actually we started it before COVID, and then, it was kind of, things got crazy after that. And then his business went a different direction, and he was a nice guy, but he finally just gave us the hard drive with all everything that he's just hours and hours and hours of everything that he's filmed. And now we want to try to put it together.
One thought I have about what I do is I put like you're going to have many, many times more material than you would use in a film. Yeah. I'd have a website like if you have different interviews with people that had the full interview. Where you can go see. Whatever works in it, that would need some editing too, probably, but you could put all your raw material on a website. It needs to be organized and make it, and it'll be work too, but it would be less work than a film. And then somebody can go see check out more about this person or that person or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's a good idea, and especially because we're trying to keep this film relatively short because our concept is to want to take it around to high school classes and stuff. And there was a film that we saw that was in a similar sort of concept of what we're trying to do, but it was like a 90-minute long film, and it was a good film. We really liked it, but we also thought if you try to show this 90-minute long film to kids in high school, you'd lose their attention. So we're trying to cut it back to something that's not going to, where the kids aren't going to go wandering by the time they get bored.
That's right. What time length are you looking at? I think we're looking at
like 15, 20 minutes of something that you can show in a class period where you can go into a high school.
That's really smart. I was thinking half an hour. That's really smart. You could also maybe come up with multiple multiple versions, you know.
Yeah, I like that idea. And I've talked to the guy about doing that too, a longer one and a shorter one. If you consider you've got a high school class, which is, 45 minutes or something, and then by the time they get the kids seated and settled down, and you can go in and talk a little bit and then have this other person that I'm hoping to get, somebody younger to help come present, show a 15, 20-minute film, and then sort of take questions afterwards and talk to them about it.
Now, when you're talking about 45 minutes, I'd say 15 because the questions and the answers.
I was saying that a lot of the high school classes are 45 minutes long, so we're looking at a 15, 20-minute film that you could show and still have time before and afterwards to talk to people.
Yeah, and then you could tell them if you want more, you could tell them where you could go, where they could go meet or something. They might want to do more follow-up with you.
Absolutely.
Well, that's cool. Well, okay, Micah, it's really good to talk with you a long time, too. It's been a while.
Yeah, you too, David. You too, for sure.
It's so interesting to me. It's also interesting and serious. Very, very serious. And, Micah's death was very sad to so many of us. And it was very sad for me to think about you and Denise and Michelle and Ken and Elizabeth and dealing with it.
I think it hit me that I never quite put together when somebody passes just how much sort of devastation there is that goes out to so many different levels with so many different people. It's really increased my amount of empathy that I just have for other people, of sort of understanding of just how painful that can be.
Yeah, I mean, when my mother died at almost 99, I was with her, and I'd been with her for 2 months, and she just slowly died. It was just inspiring. She didn't complain. She didn't take drugs. She just stopped eating and drinking. And I was just right there, a foot away from her when she died. And I wasn't sad. I thought that was beautiful. I didn't grieve, but when Micah died, I did. And it's still painful for me to think about it.
Yeah. I was actually, when Michelle's mom was getting sick from cancer, and I became her caretaker in the end because nobody else could kind of figure out how to take care of her. So I became her caretaker for quite a while. And so, I was with her at the end with hospice, and I was sitting with her when she passed, and I was sort of giving her last morphine doses sort of thing in the end. So, I've been through that sort of a process of, the process of what we assume is the typical life, right? When somebody dies, when they get older and they're sort of time to go, and then sort of the difference of that experience versus, losing your 22-year-old son when they're supposed to go.
Yeah. I think, people talk about, a young baby dying as being the worst thing. I don't think so. I think a teenager dying or somebody Micah's age, I think that's, once they, just somebody dying too soon when you've already, you're already, they're totally embedded in you. That to me is very painful, and it's worse than sad.
I kind of, the hard part is that they're just at that point where you've gone through that process of teaching them, right, what you're supposed to teach them as a child and getting them to become an adult, and now it's their time to go out in the world and create their own life, and then they don't get to start that process. Well, okay.
Micah, it's been really good talking with you. And I really appreciate everything you had to say. And
yeah, thank you, David. You too.
Yeah. Hey, drop by anytime.
I'll do that. We'll just swing on by.
Yeah. Well, you got a place here. We got a place for you here. Yeah.
I appreciate that. We've talked about doing that, visiting that part of the world. So if we make that trip, we're actually doing Costa Rica and Panama this year. So maybe the next big trip we'll have to head to Indonesia.
Yeah. Clay's coming. Clay and his partner and their baby are coming in 2 weeks.
Oh, wonderful.
Actually, 13 days. Yeah.
That'll be nice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I haven't seen him in almost 10 years.
Oh, my God.
And they're coming for 6 weeks. So,
that's wonderful.
Yeah. That's going to change things here.
Yeah. Have a great time with that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, take care, Micah.
Okay.
All right.
You too, David.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So thanks a lot, Mike. It was really good talking with you. That's the longest talk I've had with Mike, maybe ever. I mean, I knew and everything. We didn't talk for 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think we did. Anyway, thanks a lot for what you're doing and what you will be doing. And thanks to Michelle, too. And take a look at micahshugs.org. MICAHSHUGS.org. And maybe you can figure out some way to help them out. This has been a Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita. No longer guest Doggett Boombeata. His owners came back from America. So she was here 3 months. And my son Clay, who's younger than Micah by 18 years. And he and his mate April and their baby Isla just left, not long ago. They just landed a couple hours ago in San Francisco from visiting us in Bali. And hadn't seen him in 10 years. And that was great. Almost 10 years. 9 years and 9 months, something like that. Anyway, it was wonderful. They were here 6 weeks. It was a wipeout. I slept 9 hours yesterday, and then I took a 2-hour nap. And, yeah. And then I went and got a massage, which I hadn't done in a couple of months, which is quite affordable here, say the least. And anyway, all of us are wishing you and yours a grand awakening.